In the year 1893, Providence, Rhode Island, bore witness to one of the most ambitious charitable ventures ever unveiled by its wealthiest family. The Higginses announced the creation of what they proudly named the Higgins Orphan Experiment, a place they claimed would gather the city's abandoned children into safety and order, where innocence could be preserved and futures carefully shaped. They spoke of it as both a mission and a promise, an experiment in mercy, discipline, and progress. On paper, dozens of boys and girls were recorded within, their lives sketched neatly in ledgers, their growth tracked in precise detail. Yet outside those locked gates, no neighbor, no priest, and no schoolteacher ever saw them. It was an orphanage built of stone and shadow, a home for children who seemed to exist only in ink. The Higgins family's reputation at the time was untouchable. Descendants of early industrialists, they had made their fortune in textiles and later in railroads, earning both immense wealth and political favor. Patriarch Edward Higgins styled himself as a reformer in the grand Gilded Age tradition. His wife, Margaret, spoke often at church meetings about charity and Christian duty, while their eldest son, Charles, cultivated friendships with city officials and newspaper editors. They wrapped themselves in the language of philanthropy, insisting their orphanage was a model of modern progress. In speeches, Edward Higgins declared that his experiment would prove how science and discipline could transform the city's unwanted children into upright citizens. He spoke of innovation, education, and moral guidance, but in the streets surrounding the institution, rumors grew that no such children were ever seen walking to school. No laughter ever rang from the yard, and no little shoes left tracks in the winter snow. The building itself only deepened the mystery. Constructed on a windswept hill at the edge of Providence, the orphanage loomed like a fortress. Its windows were tall but curtained, its gates heavy and always locked. Carriages arrived often, carrying crates and supplies, but never parents or guardians dropping children at its steps. The grounds were meticulously tended, yet eerily silent. Locals who passed by at dusk spoke of seeing lights in the upper floors, yet never the silhouettes of children against the glass. Those who lived closest insisted the air carried strange sounds, the whir of machinery, the scrape of iron, sometimes even muffled cries that faded before anyone could be certain. Still, official reports painted a picture of thriving success. The census of that year listed 42 children under the orphanage's care. Church records spoke of baptisms and confirmations, with the name Higgins stamped boldly across the ledgers as benefactors. When the city council allocated funding, no one questioned the glowing reports submitted by the family. The Higgins Orphan Experiment was lauded as one of the finest examples of modern charity in New England. Yet as the months turned into years, unease spread among those who watched too closely. A local teacher recalled how she received rosters of orphans who were supposedly under her instruction, but the pupils never appeared in her classroom. A physician summoned once for routine examinations was brought into a wing of the orphanage that, he later claimed, contained only locked doors and empty cots. When he pressed for the children, attendants hurried him out, insisting they were resting. And a priest who came to administer Holy Communion described a service attended only by staff men and women who bowed their heads but never produced the children they claimed to shelter. The Higgins family explained it all away. They said the orphans were fragile, needing privacy and specialized care. They claimed their experiment required careful isolation, lest the outside world corrupt the progress they were making. These explanations satisfied the city's elite, who were more eager to celebrate philanthropy than to probe its shadows. But among ordinary townsfolk, doubts hardened into legend that the Higgins Orphan Experiment was not a sanctuary at all, but something else entirely. The contradiction became impossible to ignore in the winter of 1895, when an influenza outbreak struck Providence. Orphanages across the state reported sickness, and newspapers published long lists of the afflicted. The Higgins Orphan Experiment, however, reported nothing, not a single case, not a single death. Yet, in the night, neighbors swore they saw black-clad figures carrying covered stretchers out the back gates. When they pressed the family for answers, the Higginses insisted their orphans had been spared, miraculously protected by the advanced methods of their experiment. That word experiment began to unsettle even their allies. What did it mean? Why did Edward Higgins refuse to call it simply an orphanage? Why did the ledgers include names that reappeared year after year, as if the children never grew older? Why did census clerks notice handwriting that seemed too uniform? Signatures that looked as though one pen had written them all? Questions mounted, but the Higginses' wealth and influence shielded them from consequence. The institution remained open, funded, and praised, even as suspicion curled around its foundations like ivy on stone. By the close of the decade, whispers had spread through every parish and marketplace in Providence that the Higgins orphan experiment was nothing more than a facade. Some said it was a scam to drain funds from the city. Others swore it hid something darker: medical trials, occult rituals, or experiments on flesh and memory itself. The truth remained locked behind the barred windows of the orphanage, its secrets known only to the family who built it. And so the Higgins orphan experiment endured as a paradox, a home for children that never played, never grew, never lived beyond paper records. The story of the orphanage that wasn't had only begun, and those who tried to uncover its secrets would find themselves descending into a darkness far deeper than charity gone astray. When investigators and journalists finally turned their attention to the Higgins orphan experiment in the mid-1890s, the first cracks in the grand facade appeared not in the building itself, but in the paper trail. The orphanage had been praised in sermons and civic meetings for its efficiency, its remarkable success in raising scores of unwanted children into model citizens. Yet, when one looked closer at the ledgers, the census rolls, and the baptismal records that should have anchored such claims in truth, the children began to unravel like ink smudged in the rain. They were there on paper, dozens upon dozens of names written in precise copperplate script, but nowhere else in the world. The orphanage maintained immaculate registers. Each child was given a name, a date of birth, and often a note of how they had come into the institution's care. Pages bore neat annotations of supposed daily routines: when they rose for morning prayers, what lessons were taught, how many hours were devoted to sewing, reading, or arithmetic. The entries even listed illnesses, measles, coughs, fatigue, that gave the impression of a bustling household of vulnerable, living wards. At a glance, it was an administrator's dream: order, record-keeping, accountability. Yet the very perfection of these ledgers raised questions. The handwriting, though attributed to different clerks over the years, never changed. The pen strokes were steady, deliberate, and eerily uniform, as though copied from a single hand. When the state census of 1895 was published, the Higgins orphan experiment reported 42 children within its care. The census takers dutifully transcribed these names, later cited by Edward Higgins as proof of his success. But teachers in Providence schools noted that not one of these children had ever appeared in their classrooms. No baptismal certificates beyond a handful of recycled names could be located in church archives. Parish priests muttered quietly that they had been asked to sign off on children they had never held at the font. And when city clerks attempted to follow the trail into burial records, expecting to find at least a few entries for children who had succumbed to illness in an era when mortality was cruelly common, they found none. Not a single grave bore the name of a Higgins orphan. This absence was not merely unusual, it was impossible. Orphanages of the 19th century were dangerous places, their young charges vulnerable to consumption, scarlet fever, influenza, and the unrelenting wear of malnutrition. Death records were an unavoidable feature of every institution across New England. Yet, for the Higgins orphan experiment, there was only silence, as if the children lived eternally on the page, untouched by sickness or age. Contradictions abounded. In one annual report to the city council, Margaret Higgins praised a group of orphans who had supposedly sung at a Christmas service in 1894. The congregation remembered the event well, but they recalled no choir of children, only the Higgins family themselves, offering hymns accompanied by a hired organist. In another document, Charles Higgins boasted of apprenticeships arranged for older boys, Yet, none of the factories listed could confirm employing them. Foremen consulted payroll books and shook their heads. No such lads had ever set foot on their floors. Even the smallest details betrayed inconsistencies. A ledger entry described a girl named Anna receiving new shoes from a local cobbler. Yet, when that cobbler, an aging German immigrant named Hoffman, was asked about her, he insisted he had never measured a child from the orphanage. He recalled selling leather boots to Edward Higgins himself, but never to any little girl. Another page listed a boy, Samuel, as having been confirmed at the parish of St. Mary's. The priest there, Father Callahan, denied ever seeing him. "I baptized Higgins' money," he said bitterly, "but never Higgins' children." The more the records were examined, the clearer the pattern became. The Higgins orphan experiment relied on what came to be called ghost enrollment. By inflating the number of orphans in their care, they could demand larger sums from city grants, private donors, and church tithes. Every name added to the register was a coin in their purse. Every line of neat script another brick in their wall of respectability. But ghost enrollment alone did not explain the unease that clung to the orphanage. For what purpose did the Higginses maintain such elaborate fictions when simpler forgeries might have sufficed? Why insist on details, illnesses, daily chores, confirmation dates that invited contradiction? Some believed the answer lay in psychology. To justify their deception, the Higgins family had to surround themselves with layers of fabricated reality. The children were written into existence so thoroughly that, at least within the orphanage walls, they became real in the telling. Others suspected a darker motive. The meticulous records, so carefully maintained, read less like charity and more like research notes. To skeptics, the Higgins orphan experiment was not about raising orphans at all, but about sustaining the appearance of children for purposes yet unknown. By 1897, journalists from smaller papers began to whisper of scandal. They noted how certain names persisted year after year without aging, as though the same children were perpetually 6, 7, or 8 years old. They noticed that census clerks received their information not through door-to-door visitation, as was standard, but from documents handed directly to them by the Higginses. Whenever skeptics asked to interview the children, the family refused, citing illness, shyness, or the importance of isolation to the experiment. No one could yet prove the full scope of the fraud. The Higgins family's wealth and connections ensured that records were accepted, signatures respected, and doubts smothered. But the unease remained. The orphanage had children enough to fill a ledger, but not a schoolroom, a chapel, or a graveyard. The Higgins orphan experiment was swelling with paper children, ink, and illusion, standing in place of flesh and blood. And so, the stage was set for deeper inquiries, when rumors would give way to testimonies, and whispers would sharpen into accusations. What began as a clerical curiosity, a mismatch of ledgers and lives, would grow into a haunting question that no official dared answer. If the Higgins children never existed, then what, exactly, was housed behind the orphanage walls? The Higgins family of Providence were not merely wealthy. They were entrenched in the very fabric of power that governed late 19th century New England. By the 1880s, they had risen from textile magnates into railroad investors, accumulating fortunes that stretched across generations. Edward Higgins, the patriarch, cultivated the image of a self-made man, though his fortune had been built on the backs of exploited laborers and questionable contracts with city officials. Margaret Higgins, his wife, became the face of charity, hosting luncheons, speaking at churches, and weaving a narrative that their wealth was a blessing meant to be shared. Their eldest son, Charles, moved easily through political circles, securing the family's seat at every table where decisions were made. In their hands, philanthropy became currency-purchased goodwill that masked ambition and silenced scrutiny. The Higgins orphan experiment was the crown jewel of their philanthropy. While factories clattered with looms and the railroads cut through farmland, the family pointed to their orphanage as proof that they were not simply profiteers, but guardians of the vulnerable. They spoke eloquently about Christian duty and modern science, blending moral rhetoric with the language of progress. To society's upper ranks, this veneer was irresistible. Politicians admired the family's generosity, clergymen praised their apparent devotion, and newspapers ran glowing profiles that compared Edward Higgins to the great reformers of Europe. Few questioned what lay beneath the polished speeches and staged photographs of charitable dinners. Yet charity was the Higgins family's most effective disguise. While their donations to churches and hospitals earned them seats of honor at banquets, behind the scenes they tightened their grip on city contracts and silenced critics with gifts. When questions arose about the orphanage, why no children were seen in schools, why baptismal records seemed thin, their political allies dismissed concerns as slander. It was unthinkable to accuse benefactors of deception, and so suspicion was buried under layers of gratitude. Even whispers from servants and neighbors fell on deaf ears. To challenge the Higgins family was to challenge the very network of power that kept Providence thriving. The orphanage itself reflected this duality, grand in appearance, but menacing in detail. From the road, the building looked almost majestic, a sprawling stone structure with arched windows and a bell tower that gave the impression of a chapel. Yet a closer look revealed that many of those windows were sealed shut, their curtains never drawn aside. Iron bars crossed the lower levels, more like a prison than a sanctuary. Visitors permitted entry described long corridors lit by gas lamps, their walls lined with locked doors. Shuttered basements lay below, barred with heavy chains and padlocks so large they seemed designed to keep something in, rather than keep intruders out. Neighbors told stories of what they saw when they passed at night. Some swore that shadows moved behind the upper windows, though no sound of play or chatter followed. Others reported flickers of blue light, as if strange devices were humming within. The air around the estate felt different, heavy with silence, disturbed only by the creak of the iron gates when the wind forced them to groan. For the children supposedly housed there were no toys scattered on the lawn, no chalk drawings on the stone steps, no handprints on frosted panes. The orphanage seemed less like a home and more like a stage set, designed to convince the public from afar, while concealing whatever occurred inside. Even the grounds bore marks of contradiction. The gardens were immaculately trimmed, each hedge squared and each bed of roses pruned to precision, yet no child ever plucked a flower or chased a butterfly across the grass. The stables, once built for the family's carriages, were locked and shuttered, though neighbors recalled seeing wagons slip through the gates after midnight. The bell tower never rang for morning prayers or for supper, but townsfolk claimed to hear low mechanical noises drifting from it when the rest of the city slept. The Higgins estate became a place of fascination and unease, a monument to wealth and secrecy that loomed above Providence like a sentinel watching over its own lies. Inside, the Gothic details were even more unsettling. Visitors invited for charity events were restricted to a few select rooms, a reception hall lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, a dining room dressed in velvet draperies, and a parlor adorned with heavy chandeliers. Beyond these spaces, guests were never permitted to wander. Doors were bolted, staircases roped off, and attendants ushered guests away from any corridor that might lead deeper into the house. One physician later recalled that when he attempted to examine the lower wards, he was intercepted by Charles Higgins himself, who pressed a generous envelope into his hand and suggested that his services were no longer required. The Higgins legacy was built on this careful balance, public benevolence on the surface, darkness sealed tightly beneath. They understood that true power was not just in wealth, but in perception. By cloaking their ambitions in charity, they ensured that anyone who doubted them seemed cruel or ungrateful. To the city, they were saviors. To those who looked closer, they were wardens of an edifice that resembled not an orphanage, but a mausoleum of secrets. And so the Higgins orphan experiment continued to flourish on paper, nourished by political ties and fortified by social standing. Behind the barred windows and shuttered basements, something else was unfolding, shielded from the eyes of the public. The legacy of the Higgins family was not only one of wealth and reform, it was one of control, deception, and a fortress built to contain truths too unsettling for polite society to acknowledge. By the late 1890s, the Higgins orphan experiment was already wrapped in whispers, and those whispers came most often from the lips of the people who lived nearest to its looming walls. For the neighbors who passed the estate each evening, the orphanage was not a beacon of charity, but a place of dread. They spoke of strange noises that crept through the night, air sounds that no sanctuary for children should produce. One woman, a laundress whose cottage faced the gates, told her parish priest she had heard chanting rising from the orphanage after midnight, low and rhythmic, as though an entire congregation were repeating verses in some unfamiliar tongue. Others swore they heard the whir of machines, metallic grinding, and the hiss of steam, unlike anything found in a household. And sometimes, cutting through these unnatural sounds, came what seemed unmistakably like the cries of children, faint, muffled, and quickly silenced. The city's elite dismissed such claims as superstition, the gossip of servants and tradesmen. But among the working people of Providence, the stories spread like wildfire. Mothers warned their children not to linger near the Higgins estate. Farmers passing with wagons after dusk made the sign of the cross as they hurried their horses. Some claimed the sounds were carried on the wind. First the clink of iron restraints, then the unmistakable sobs of the very orphans the Higgins family swore were safe within their walls. The orphanage was supposed to be filled with laughter and learning. Instead, it was remembered for silence, broken only by cries that left listeners uneasy and sleepless. Several workers came forward in private, though never publicly. They were men and women hired to clean the grounds, to bring coal for the furnaces, or to mend the fencing. Each described the same unease. They were never allowed to enter certain wings, never permitted to see the children. One gardener confided that he once glimpsed a basement door left ajar and heard the clatter of glass instruments inside, as if bottles were being shifted and liquids poured. Another recalled the acrid smell of chemicals drifting up through floorboards, so sharp it burned the throat. But when these workers whispered their fears to outsiders, they soon fell silent again. Some were dismissed from service without explanation. Others admitted they had signed contracts that forbade them to speak of anything they witnessed. The Higgins family ensured loyalty with coin, and when coin failed, they relied on threats. Rumors soon gave the place a reputation darker than any official report could contain. People said the Higginses were less interested in raising orphans than in experimenting upon them. No one could say exactly what kind of experiments were taking place, but the theories themselves became the language of legend. Some whispered that the family used the children as subjects for medical trials, testing drugs and electrical devices under the guise of treatment. Others believed something more occult was hidden beneath the respectable surface, that the chanting neighbors heard was not prayer but ritual, an attempt to bind spirits or manipulate the mind. Whatever the truth, the fact remained that the orphans appeared only in ledgers and never in the streets, a ghost population spoken of but never seen. One tale, repeated in hushed voices, came from a delivery man who brought barrels of milk each week to the orphanage. He claimed that one winter morning he arrived early, and, as the gates opened, he heard a chorus of voices chanting from deep within the building. The words were indistinct, but the rhythm was unmistakable. He asked the servant who took the delivery what the children were doing awake at such an hour. The servant froze, eyes wide, and whispered, "That is not the children," before slamming the gates shut behind him. Others told of seeing flickers of light through the shuttered windows, bright flashes, followed by silence, as though experiments involving electricity were being conducted. An old blacksmith swore he saw sparks jump into the night sky above the orphanage roof, like lightning without thunder. For days afterward, he insisted his anvil rang strangely, as if the very air had been charged. Such stories blurred the line between rumor and folklore, but they spread quickly, cementing the orphanage's reputation as a place where natural laws were twisted. By then, even tradesmen who profited from Higgins' contracts felt unease. Some said that once you entered the gates, time felt different moments dragged, and shadows clung unnaturally to the corners of the halls. One mason hired to repair the outer wall described hearing a child's voice call his name in broad daylight, though no one was there. He left the site and refused to return, forfeiting his pay rather than step inside again. Despite this, official silence persisted. The Higginses continued to attend church, to donate generously, to sit on civic boards. Their reputation insulated them, and those who muttered about experiments were dismissed as gossips. Yet, the testimonies endured. They clung to the estate like ivy, spreading across taverns, markets, and parlors, weaving a counter-narrative that no amount of wealth could erase. The orphanage was not a sanctuary, it was a locked house where something hidden moved in the night, something the neighbors could hear but never see. The legacy of these early rumors was powerful. They transformed the Higgins orphan experiment from a celebrated institution into a haunted landmark, one that townsfolk avoided even in daylight. By the turn of the century, no one passed its gates without unease. Its barred windows and shuttered basements became symbols not of protection but of secrecy, and the testimonies from the town, whispered by laundresses, milkmen, gardeners, and blacksmiths, became the first fragile cracks in the carefully constructed wall of lies the Higgins family had built around their legacy. The deeper investigators dug into the Higgins orphan experiment, the more the mystery shifted from what was present to what was absent. In Providence, where every baptism was supposed to be recorded by parish priests and every birth marked by city clerks, the absence of documentation became its own damning evidence. The Higgins family boasted of dozens of children under their care, yet the official records of the city and the church revealed gaps wide enough to swallow generations. Clerks were the first to note the inconsistencies. By the year 1896, questions began to stir in the city hall offices, where census data, birth certificates, and parish transfers were meant to align. Names listed in the orphanage ledgers appeared nowhere else. Children, supposedly born in Providence, had no birth certificates filed. Clerks searching the registry books found blank spaces where dates should have been. Or worse, entries written in hands they did not recognize, as though someone had slipped false records between the pages. One clerk, who dared to speak off the record, described the experience as, like chasing shadows. The children exist only where the Higgins family says they do, never in the places where every other child of the city is found. Parish priests, too, found themselves entangled in the strange absence. In Roman Catholic churches, baptisms were the sacred threshold that brought infants into the fold, their names and godparents carefully inscribed into heavy leather-bound volumes. Yet when priests went back through their registers, they found only a handful of Higgins orphans ever baptized, and even these few raised questions. The handwriting was suspiciously similar across different parishes. The godparents named were sometimes strangers to the congregation, and in one case, the same infant was apparently baptized twice under slightly altered names. Priests grew uneasy but rarely pressed further. After all, the Higgins family gave generously to church renovations, altars, and poor relief funds. To accuse them openly would be to risk the lifeblood of the parish treasury. The midwives, however, told a more chilling story. In neighborhoods surrounding Providence, these women had long been the guardians of birth. They attended expectant mothers, delivered infants, and reported names to city clerks. But by the 1890s, some began whispering of babies who vanished into Higgins' hands. They told of young women, often unmarried and desperate, who were persuaded or pressured into surrendering their infants directly to the orphanage. These children never appeared in public registers, never appeared in adoption notices, never even received baptism. It was as if the moment they were carried through the orphanage gates, they ceased to exist in the world beyond. One midwife, an Irish woman named Nora Callahan, admitted late in life that she delivered a boy in the summer of 1891 for a poor girl who had been sent to the Higginses for help. The child was taken from the mother within hours, bundled away to the orphanage carriage. When Nora later searched for his baptismal record, she found nothing. The mother herself disappeared soon after, sent to work in a textile mill upstate. It was as if neither of them had ever lived, Nora told her niece decades later. Her testimony was never recorded in official proceedings, but the story became one of many whispered accounts that added flesh to the suspicions. The absence of adoption records compounded the unease. Edward and Margaret Higgins frequently spoke of their great success in placing orphans with families across New England. At charity banquets, they praised themselves for giving children futures beyond the institution's walls. Yet when journalists and city inspectors searched the archives for adoption records, they found none. Families who had supposedly taken in Higgins orphans could not be identified. No court petitions, no transfer papers, no guardianship documents existed. Each time an inspector pressed the matter, the family produced vague answers. The records, they claimed, had been misplaced in a flood. The courts had been slow to process. Or, most often, they insisted privacy laws prevented them from sharing names. Behind this veil of excuses, the truth remained hidden. The contradictions became more striking as years passed. Children listed in ledgers from 1893 appeared again in ledgers from 1897, unaged, unchanged, their descriptions identical. Yet there were no corresponding adoption files to explain why they remained. When questioned, Higgins' staff shrugged and claimed the placements had fallen through. The children returned to the orphanage. Clerks noticed that even the handwriting in the adoption entries matched the same neat copperplate that filled every page of the orphanage's accounts. It was as though the Higgins family themselves were inventing the lives of children they never housed, moving them from one ledger to the next like pieces on a board. By the turn of the century, a few brave officials attempted to raise alarms. One parish priest wrote privately to his bishop that there are names that belong only to books, not to souls. A city clerk filed a report suggesting the orphanage was inflating numbers for fraudulent gain. Yet both men found themselves silenced. The bishop cautioned the priest to remain grateful for Higgins' donations, while the clerk was abruptly reassigned to a different office. The Higgins legacy was too deeply rooted, their influence too wide-reaching, for isolated voices to dislodge. To the public eye, the orphanage remained a triumph of philanthropy. But among those who handled the records, the clerks with their ink-stained fingers, the priests leafing through sacred volumes, the midwives with their fading memories, the truth was clearer. The Higgins children were not merely neglected or hidden. Many had never been recorded at all, erased from the start, absorbed into an institution that thrived on absence. Birth certificates that never appeared, baptisms that never happened, adoptions that never left a trace. These were the shadows that defined the Higgins orphan experiment. What should have been the simplest proof of the children's existence, their entrance into the world and their passage into faith, was instead a void. And in that void, rumors of fraud gave way to darker questions. If the Higgins family did not truly shelter orphans, then why did they go to such lengths to create the illusion of them? What purpose was served by conjuring children into ledgers only to erase them from every other corner of life? The missing birth records became more than clerical oddities. They became a chilling suggestion that the Higginses were not running an orphanage at all, but constructing a fiction to conceal something far more unsettling. The Higgins orphan experiment did not thrive on secrecy alone. It thrived because men of authority, doctors, priests, and civic leaders chose silence. Each had glimpses of the truth. Each brushed against the unsettling absence of real children within those high stone walls. Yet all stepped back rather than step forward. Some were bribed, some were cowed, and some convinced themselves it was better not to know. Their silence became the mortar that held the orphanage's false facade together. Among the first to voice unease were visiting clergy. The Higgins family had constructed a chapel within the orphanage itself, a modest Gothic structure with a narrow nave and stained glass windows depicting scenes of Christian charity. Margaret Higgins often invited priests to lead services there, proudly presenting the orphanage as a model of both spiritual and social reform. Yet those who accepted the invitation often left with a sense of disquiet. They noted that the pews were filled not with children, but with staff, all adults, heads bowed in dutiful silence. Priests asked where the orphans were, only to be told that the little ones were too frail to join public services, that they prayed quietly in their wards instead. One clergyman, Father O'Malley, confided to a colleague that during his sermon he heard faint sounds rising from beneath the chapel floor, murmurs that did not belong to the gathered congregation. At first he thought it was echoes in the stone, but the noises continued, hushed voices layered with what sounded like the clink of metal. When he pressed the family afterward, Edward Higgins laughed it off as pipes settling, while Margaret insisted that the sick children were housed below and that their faint cries were the unfortunate but unavoidable background of her mission. The priest was shaken, but he said nothing further. The Higginses had just funded the restoration of his parish roof, and his bishop urged gratitude rather than scandal. Physicians, too, found themselves caught in this web of contradictions. Over the years, several were summoned to the orphanage to examine ailing children. These doctors arrived expecting wards filled with coughing or fevered patients, yet they were led instead down narrow corridors to locked rooms where attendants described symptoms but never opened the doors. On rare occasions, a childlike form was shown from a distance, wrapped heavily in blankets, the face obscured. Physicians were asked to prescribe tonics or recommend treatments, but never allowed to perform thorough examinations. Many left uneasy, muttering that they had treated ghosts rather than patients. One doctor, whose notes were later discovered in a private journal, wrote of being brought into a room where a child supposedly lay feverish. The bed was curtained, the figure small beneath the covers. When he reached to check the child's pulse, the attendant intervened, insisting the patient was too weak to be disturbed. He was handed instead a vial of urine and told to diagnose from that alone. The doctor complied, but left with the dreadful suspicion that there had been no child in that bed at all. Yet he never reported his doubts. The Higgins family controlled lucrative contracts, and a physician who offended them risked not only his livelihood, but his reputation. This pattern of unease, followed by silence, repeated itself across professions. Priests who wondered why children never attended Mass looked away when the Higginses filled collection plates with generous sums. Doctors who sensed deception accepted payment for their time and told themselves they had done their duty. City officials who noticed census contradictions chose to enjoy the Higgins family's hospitality at dinners instead of probing further. The systemic complicity was almost ritualistic. Each authority figure was given just enough reason to doubt their own suspicion and just enough benefit to remain quiet. The Higginses understood this balance well. They cultivated allies in government, funded church repairs, and offered medical men handsome fees. No one wanted to risk losing Higgins' patronage, and so each accepted the official narrative. The orphans were real, only fragile, hidden away for their protection. Behind closed doors, some confessed their doubts. A priest might murmur to another over a glass of wine that he had not seen a single child at the orphanage service. A physician might remark in private that he had been asked to prescribe for patients he never touched, but in public, they praised the Higginses as benefactors. The silence was not accidental, it was sustained, chosen, and enforced. In this way, the Higgins orphan experiment became more than a family's deception. It became a communal performance in which church, medicine, and state all played their parts. Each man of authority who turned his eyes away strengthened the illusion that children thrived within the orphanage walls. And with every sermon preached in the chapel, every medical bill signed, every council report approved, the truth was buried deeper. The silence of priests lent the orphanage moral legitimacy. The silence of doctors lent it the sheen of medical care. The silence of officials lent it political protection. Together, they formed a circle of complicity that no ordinary townsman could break. And within that circle, the cries and whispers heard at night by neighbors remained only rumors, never confirmed, never investigated. Thus, the Higgins orphan experiment endured not simply because of the family's wealth, but because those entrusted with safeguarding souls, bodies, and laws chose not to pry. Their silence was the strongest wall of all, stronger even than the barred windows and shuttered basements. It was the silence of those who might have uncovered the truth, but instead chose to preserve their own comfort. And in that silence, the children who never existed became unassailable phantoms, protected by the very institutions that should have exposed them. When the Higgins orphan experiment finally came under true investigation in the early years of the 20th century, the most unsettling discoveries were not found in ledgers or council records, but beneath the very floors of the institution itself. The orphanage that looked so quiet and impenetrable from the outside concealed a labyrinth of basements and tunnels, a subterranean world that told a darker story than any paper trail could. What had been dismissed as rumor by neighbors, the muffled cries, the sounds of machinery, the faint humming at night, suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like testimony. The first descent into the orphanage cellars revealed far more than storage rooms. Behind bolted doors and concealed trapdoors lay chambers carved out of the bedrock, connected by narrow stone passages that branched like veins. Some were crude, their walls damp and unfinished, but others were meticulously designed, as though intended for more than mere function. Investigators described rows of numbered iron bedsteads, each stripped bare, no sheets or pillows, only rusted frames standing like skeletal remains of wards that had never been occupied. The numbers painted above them were uneven, some smeared with chalk markings that had been hastily rubbed out. It was as if the place had once been prepared for children who never arrived, or worse, for children who had arrived but were never meant to leave. Deeper within the tunnels, discoveries became stranger still. Wooden crates, filled with leather straps and restraints, lay abandoned, some stained, others frayed from use. Along the walls hung copper devices whose purpose was unclear, headpieces with dangling wires, plates etched with curious patterns, and coils wound tightly around glass cylinders. They resembled crude medical instruments, yet none matched known tools of contemporary science. Nearby tables were littered with notebooks bound in leather, their pages filled with sketches of anatomy, calculations, and diagrams of electrical currents running through human forms. The handwriting matched that found in the orphanage ledgers, the same precise, careful copper plate that had once described the daily prayers of children who did not exist. The atmosphere in those underground chambers unsettled even the most hardened investigators. The air was stale, heavy with the odor of rust, mold, and something sharper, chemical traces that clung to the nose and throat. Candles guttered in the damp, their light revealing chalk symbols scrawled across the stone floors. Circles intersected with lines, grids marked with numbers, and words half erased but still legible. Subject, trial, retention. Some walls bore scratch marks, shallow at first, then deeper, as though fingernails had clawed at the stone in desperation. To those who entered, it felt less like a basement and more like a mausoleum of unspoken horrors. One chamber in particular drew attention, a circular room with a single iron chair bolted to the floor. Around it, copper wires radiated outward like spokes on a wheel, connecting to smaller stools arranged in a ring. The setup resembled some grotesque theater of science, a central subject surrounded by observers, or perhaps participants. The iron chair bore grooves in its arms, where leather straps had once bound wrists. A chalk number was scrawled above the chair on the wall, 32. Yet no 32 was ever found in the orphanage ledgers. Journal pages discovered nearby described procedures in chilling detail. Notes spoke of testing resilience under current, of memory retention during stimulus, and of transference attempts. The language was clinical, but the implications were clear. The Higgins family had not been raising orphans, they had been experimenting, using the illusion of children to secure funding while their real focus lay in hidden laboratories beneath their estate. Whether actual children had ever been subjected to these experiments remained uncertain, but the evidence suggested preparation on a scale far beyond fraud. The tunnels stretched further than expected, branching toward the stables and even into adjoining properties once owned by the family. In one passage, investigators found a locked steel door that resisted all attempts to open it. Behind it, faint echoes carried, as if air shifted in a larger chamber. Some swore they heard the drip of water. Others claimed the smell of ozone was stronger there. But the door remained sealed, leaving its contents a matter of speculation. Every discovery deepened the Gothic character of the orphanage. The barred windows and shuttered wards above had seemed sinister enough, but the world below confirmed that secrecy was not incidental. It was structural, built into the very bones of the estate. The numbered beds, the chalk markings, the copper devices, all pointed to a design that valued precision, control, and concealment. It was less a place of shelter than a theater of deception, with the orphans themselves existing only as masks to hide the machinery beneath. When reports of these findings reached the public, outrage spread quickly. Newspapers described the tunnels in lurid detail, dubbing them the catacombs of Providence. Some writers insisted that real children must have been used, their bodies hidden away in unmarked graves. Others clung to the idea that the Higginses had fabricated everything for fraudulent gain, that the chambers were nothing more than an elaborate ruse to support their ghost enrollment. But the evidence left behind, the restraints, the journals, the numbered iron beds, refused to resolve into anything so simple. The orphanage seemed to hover in a space between fraud and atrocity, between the crime of deception and the possibility of something far darker. What lay beneath the orphanage was more than a basement. It was the hidden heart of the Higgins legacy. In those tunnels, the illusion of charity collapsed, revealing the machinery of secrecy and the architecture of fear. And in the damp silence of those empty beds, Providence was left with a question it could never answer. If the children had never existed, why did the Higginses build a world beneath their orphanage designed to contain them? For years after the Higgins orphan experiment closed its gates, silence hung over the estate like a burial shroud. The family dispersed, the building stood abandoned, and official records faded into dust. But silence is never eternal. As decades passed and those who had once worked within the orphanage grew old, some began to unburden themselves. In whispered recollections, in confessions to family members, and in rare interviews with journalists, fragments of testimony surfaced, each one more disturbing than the last. These were not the polished words of politicians or the carefully kept ledgers of the Higginses. These were the raw memories of servants, attendants, and workers who had lived in the shadow of secrets. One of the earliest voices came from a laundress named Ellen Reeves, who had been employed in the 1890s to wash bedding and clothing for the orphanage. When she spoke late in life to her granddaughter, she described how she often received bundles of linens marked with chalk numbers rather than names. Yet when she asked the matrons which child they belonged to, she was told brusquely not to question. "They told us to treat the bedding as if it had been used," Ellen recalled, but many of the sheets were spotless, folded as if no one had slept in them. She grew convinced that some of the beds were empty, prepared for children who were never there. A nursemaid named Clara, interviewed in the 1930s by a local historian, claimed she was instructed to care for cribs that contained nothing but neatly arranged pillows. "We were told to rock the cribs, to sing lullabies, even if the beds were empty," she said. When visitors came through, the matrons wanted the rooms to sound alive, as if infants were being soothed. Clara admitted that the deception troubled her, but she was young, poor, and dependent on the wages the Higgins family provided. To question the practice was to invite dismissal, and with dismissal came ruin. Other staff members described even stranger demands. A cook named Samuel reported that meals were prepared for dozens more children than ever appeared in the dining halls. Platters of porridge, bread, and broth were carried into locked wards and returned untouched hours later. "We were told the children had eaten," Samuel said, "but I never saw them. I never heard them." His testimony, like others, painted a picture of an institution carefully staging the illusion of life for children who existed only on paper. Yet not all accounts spoke of absence. Some described the presence of children fewer in number than the ledgers claimed, but undeniably real, who seemed to vanish without explanation. A maid named Margaret recounted caring for a small group of boys and girls in the early 1890s. She remembered their faces vividly, their laughter echoing faintly in the locked playrooms, but one by one, they disappeared. Each time, she was told that the child had been placed in a good home, adopted by families beyond Providence. Yet when she asked for details, no one could provide names or addresses. She later discovered that no adoption records had ever been filed for those children. It was as if they had been swallowed by the building, she whispered. The most chilling accounts came from those who claimed to have glimpsed the experiments. A handyman named Joseph, who had been tasked with repairs in the basements, told his son decades later that he once stumbled upon a chamber where a boy sat strapped to a chair, copper wires coiled around his head. Attendants ordered Joseph out immediately and warned him never to mention what he had seen. They said the boy was ill and receiving treatment, Joseph recalled, but his eyes were wide with fear, and he begged me not to leave him. When Joseph returned to that corridor days later, the chamber was locked, and he never saw the boy again. Another servant, a woman named Lydia, remembered hearing cries drifting from beneath the chapel floor during evening prayers. She described the sounds as not of illness, but of terror. When she asked her superiors about it, they told her sharply that the noises were nothing more than pipes and wind. Lydia confessed that she had always doubted this, especially after she saw attendants carrying covered stretchers out through the back gates late at night. These recollections, pieced together across decades, painted a mosaic of contradictions: empty cribs, tended as if occupied, food prepared for invisible children, real orphans who seemed to vanish, and glimpses of experiments shrouded in secrecy. Each testimony by itself might have been dismissed as the fading memory of an elderly servant, but together they echoed the same haunting truth. The Higgins orphan experiment was not what it claimed to be. By the mid-20th century, journalists began to collect these accounts. Though few were ever published in full, editors feared lawsuits from surviving members of the Higgins family, or simply dismissed the testimonies as unreliable. But in Providence, the oral tradition persisted. Families repeated the stories of grandparents who had worked behind the barred windows and shuttered basements. Each story added weight to the legend that some children were invented, some children disappeared, and perhaps some were used in ways that defied explanation. The witness accounts blurred the line between fraud and horror. To care for empty cribs suggested deception. To witness experiments suggested cruelty. And always, beneath both, was the chilling possibility that real lives had been lost in the shadows of a place that called itself an orphanage. These voices, silenced in their youth, emerged only in old age, when fear of retribution faded and memory itself became a final testimony. In their words, the Higgins orphan experiment ceased to be a matter of ledgers and records. It became a human tragedy, told through fragments of recollection, murmured lullabies to empty cribs, untouched meals carried into locked rooms, children whose names were never spoken again. Their testimonies may never prove beyond doubt what happened in those hidden chambers, but they ensure that the silence the Higgins family once enforced would never be complete. The Higgins orphan experiment did not endure through secrecy alone. It thrived because it wore the clothing of law. Where neighbors whispered of strange sounds and servants spoke in hushed tones, the family presented polished ledgers, official reports, and signatures that silenced suspicion. On paper, the orphanage was not a void of ghost children, but a model institution. Through falsified documents and carefully cultivated allies, the Higginses built a legal facade so intricate that it transformed fiction into fact, at least in the eyes of government and church. The foundation of their scheme was the reporting system itself. In the waning years of the 19th century, municipal orphanages and private institutions relied on city and state grants, their funding tied directly to the number of children housed. More orphans meant more aid, more food allowances, more subsidies for clothing, more support from religious charities. Each year, administrators were expected to provide updated counts of the children in their care. For most institutions, these counts were verified by visiting inspectors. For the Higginses, inspection rarely moved beyond their polished front parlor. Edward Higgins understood the system's weaknesses. He submitted ledgers filled with names, dozens of children, each carefully detailed with age, birth date, and fabricated ailments to justify additional funds. When inspectors called, they were greeted with hand-picked staff who repeated the same rehearsed stories. The supposed wards were said to be resting, ill, or in prayer. If pressed, attendants showed rooms filled with cribs or beds neatly arranged, though curiously empty. For some inspectors, the promise of a warm meal, a fine cigar, or a discreet envelope of money was enough to satisfy. Others, whether through laziness or fear, chose not to peer behind locked doors. The Higginses also wielded the influence of the church. Margaret Higgins positioned herself as a devout benefactress, appearing in parish bulletins and making donations to repair stained glass windows or fund new altars. Priests praised the orphanage from their pulpits, repeating the family's claims of success without ever seeing a child. When doubts surfaced, why no baptisms, why no confirmations, the Higginses offered explanations cloaked in piety. The children, they said, were too fragile for public gatherings, better protected within the walls of the orphanage chapel. Those who pushed harder risked losing generous gifts that kept their parishes alive. Few dared. Politicians proved equally pliant. Charles Higgins cultivated friendships with city councilmen and state officials, ensuring that when questions arose, allies stood ready to defend the institution. Council meetings recorded warm praise for the Higgins family's innovative care of Providence's forgotten youth. Grants were renewed without challenge, reports approved without inspection. For men eager to appear aligned with philanthropy, to be photographed shaking hands with Edward Higgins was more valuable than probing whether his orphanage truly held children. The grants flowed steadily. City coffers provided annual stipends for food, clothing, and education, all calculated according to the number of orphans listed in Higgins' reports. Religious charities supplemented this with donations of blankets, medicines, and money. Wealthy benefactors, convinced by Margaret's stirring speeches, added endowments in their wills. All of it funneled into the orphanage for children who, in truth, existed only as lines of ink in a ledger. The Higgins family had discovered a perfect machine. The more children they claimed, the more money arrived, and the more influence they purchased with those funds. When minor discrepancies arose, they were quickly smoothed over. A census clerk, who noted that certain names repeated year after year, was quietly transferred to another office. A parish priest who raised doubts in a letter to his bishop was reminded of how much the Higginses had given to his parish school. A councilman who asked about adoption records found himself the guest of honor at a Higgins banquet, where his family was promised a railway contract. In every case, the family's wealth and reach dissolved obstacles before they could harden into accusations. The facade extended even into print. Local newspapers, dependent on advertising from Higgins-owned enterprises, published glowing features about the orphanage's remarkable success. Journalists invited to the estate were shown select rooms, bright halls with polished floors, nurseries filled with empty cribs, classrooms with unused chalkboards. Photographs staged for these articles showed Margaret seated with a book, attendants smiling in the background, and captions extolling her maternal devotion. No children appeared in these images, but few readers questioned why. The legal structure of the orphanage was as carefully designed as its architecture. Every year, the Higginses filed accounts of income and expenditure, showing funds spent on food, clothing, education, and medical care. These records were so precise that auditors rarely looked deeper. In reality, much of the money was funneled into the family's other ventures, investments in railroads, properties, and political campaigns. Yet because the documents balanced on paper, no one dared accuse them of theft. To do so would mean admitting that city officials, priests, and politicians had been complicit in approving false reports for decades. What made the Higgins orphan experiment so enduring was not simply the family's skill at deception, but the eagerness of others to accept it. Church leaders preferred to believe in miracles of charity rather than confront the possibility of fraud. Politicians preferred the glow of philanthropy to the shadows of scandal. Inspectors preferred bribes and banquets to the cold labor of truth. Together, they formed a system that rewarded silence and punished curiosity. Thus, the orphanage became more than a fraud. It became a reflection of the very institutions that sustained it. The phantom children written into ledgers were not only inventions of the Higgins family, but creations of a system that measured success in numbers not in lives. Every grant tied to those names, every donation sealed by those reports, strengthened the illusion. The legal facade was not built by the Higginses alone, but by every priest who praised them, every politician who protected them, and every official who chose not to pry. In the end, the Higgins orphan experiment stood less as a sanctuary for children and more as a monument to complicity. It showed how easily the machinery of law and faith could be bent, how ghost children could become real enough to sustain an empire of wealth and power. And it left Providence with a haunting truth. Sometimes, the greatest deceptions are not hidden in shadows, but written in ledgers and sealed with signatures. By the dawn of the new century, the cracks in the Higgins orphan experiment had widened into fractures that even wealth and reputation could not entirely conceal. Journalists had begun to print whispers of phantom children. Parish priests confided their unease in guarded letters, and townsfolk spoke more openly about the cries and lights they claimed to witness from outside the barred windows. At last, the first tentative steps were taken toward prosecution. Yet, what followed was not a moment of justice, but a study in evasion, as the Higgins family used their influence to smother every spark of accountability. It would be remembered not as a trial, but as the trial that never was. The initial effort came in the form of a petition by reformers who demanded that the city conduct a thorough audit of the orphanage. They cited missing birth records, absent adoption files, and the suspicious uniformity of the ledgers. Inspectors were dispatched, but the documents they required vanished before they could be reviewed. Boxes of parish baptismal records disappeared from church vaults. Adoption petitions thought to be stored at the courthouse were suddenly missing. Even census forms, already copied into official ledgers, were found to have been tampered with, entries smudged, names altered, dates crossed out, and rewritten in fresh ink. It was as if an invisible hand had swept through Providence, erasing every scrap of evidence before it could be laid bare. Still, the accusations could not be silenced entirely. Rumors reached the ears of state officials, and in 1899, a grand jury was quietly convened. Witnesses were summoned, including former staff who spoke of empty cribs and untouched meals. One midwife testified that she had delivered infants into Higgins' hands, who were never baptized or recorded anywhere else. Yet when her testimony was compared against official registers, her account seemed unsupported. Birth records were gone, baptismal logs incomplete. Without documents to corroborate her words, the jurors grew hesitant. Physicians who had been summoned to the orphanage also testified, but their recollections were riddled with uncertainty. One doctor admitted that he had never examined a child directly, only vials of urine and accounts provided by attendants. Another recalled being shown a figure swaddled in blankets but confessed he could not swear whether it had been a child at all. Their words cast suspicion, but suspicion was not enough for conviction. Judges required proof, and proof had already been spirited away. The Higgins family appeared at these hearings cloaked in dignity. Edward Higgins arrived in a dark suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, and reminded the court of his decades of service to Providence. Margaret spoke eloquently of Christian charity, describing the anguish of watching our fragile little ones maligned by scandal. Charles presented meticulously copied ledgers, filled with names and neat accounts, which he swore were accurate. The family positioned themselves not as perpetrators but as victims, wounded by slander. Their allies in politics and the church echoed these sentiments, warning that to condemn the Higginses would be to undermine Providence's proudest legacy of philanthropy. Judges, faced with the absence of hard evidence, declared the case insufficient. The accusations, they said, were troubling but unproven. Without clear documentation of fraud, without living witnesses who could testify to being phantom orphans, the law could not intervene. "We cannot prosecute on rumor," one judge pronounced, "nor condemn a family whose record of public service shines so brightly." With that, the proceedings collapsed. For the citizens of Providence, the collapse of the case was confirmation of what they already suspected, that the Higginses were untouchable. Their money flowed too freely through the veins of the city, nourishing politicians, priests, and businessmen alike. Any attempt to expose them was choked by the very institutions that had profited from their deception. The trial that never was became a symbol of power's ability to bend truth into silence. Shortly thereafter, the Higgins family took their final step in dissolving the scandal. They quietly shut the doors of the orphanage. There was no formal announcement, no ceremony of closure. One season the gates were locked, the next the windows were shuttered, and by the following year, the estate stood silent. Official reports claimed the orphans had been placed in private homes across the state, but again, no records of adoption were ever produced. The building remained, empty but intact, its chapel, wards, and basements left to dust and shadows. By the time Providence residents realized the institution was no longer operating, the Higginses had already retreated into their wealth. Edward retired to a country estate, Margaret withdrew from public life, and Charles turned his focus to business investments far from Rhode Island. The family never faced another summons, never answered another question. The orphanage, once paraded as their greatest achievement, was abandoned without explanation, left to loom over the city like a monument to unanswered questions. In the end, the Higgins orphan experiment did not collapse under the weight of scandal. It was quietly dissolved, absorbed into silence. No graves were ever uncovered, no children reclaimed, no documents restored. What remained was absence. The missing records, the missing children, the missing trial that might have brought truth into the open. The people of Providence were left with only stories, fragments of testimony, and the uneasy knowledge that the law had chosen not to see. Thus, the Higgins orphan experiment became less a tale of charity and fraud than a testament to complicity. It revealed how a family could weave phantom children into ledgers, erase their traces from official archives, and walk away untouched. The trial that never was ensured that the truth of what happened within those barred windows and shuttered basements would never be settled in court. Instead, it lived on in whispers, in testimonies passed from one generation to the next, haunting Providence like a shadow that refused to fade. When the Higgins orphan experiment finally stood abandoned, its gates rusting and windows boarded, the institution did not fade quietly into history. Instead, it transformed into legend. The silence that once protected the Higgins family gave way to whispers that lingered across generations, until the orphanage itself became more ghost than stone. Without records to explain what had truly happened inside its walls, the people of Providence filled the void with stories, and those stories became the folklore of a betrayed city. The most enduring tales spoke of children's cries drifting from the ruins long after the orphanage had closed. Neighbors swore that on cold nights, when the wind swept through the shuttered halls, one could hear the muffled sobbing of little ones calling for comfort. A fisherman who lived near the river claimed that, as he walked home at dusk, he often heard lullabies echoing faintly from the upper windows, songs without voices, carried by no living breath. Others told of footsteps pattering across the stone courtyard, though the gates had been locked for decades. For many, these sounds were not merely haunting, they were the voices of the phantom orphans, the paper children given existence by ink and deception, crying out for the lives they had been denied. Spectral figures also became part of the folklore. Passers-by described seeing pale shapes at the windows, children staring out with hollow eyes, women in dark gowns moving through the chapel, and once, according to a group of boys who dared each other to trespass, a tall man with silver hair watching them from the bell tower before vanishing. Farmers traveling with wagons after sunset hurried their horses past the orphanage, muttering prayers as they claimed to glimpse faces pressed against the glass. Even after the windows were bricked and boarded, stories continued, shadows seen where no light should fall, a thin hand appearing against wood before sinking away. The chapel, once a place of supposed prayer, became a particular focus of rumor. Children dared each other to run up the orphanage steps and press their ears to the heavy chapel doors. Those who did swore they heard faint chanting from within, a low rhythmic hum that rose and fell like waves. Parents scolded them, but the stories spread. Some said the chanting was the voice of priests complicit in the deception, their words echoing across time. Others believed it was the machinery of the experiments, still humming beneath the floors, replaying its hidden work forever. Over time, the Higgins orphan experiment shifted in the city's memory from an institution of fraud into a symbol of betrayal. Providence had been promised a sanctuary for its most vulnerable children, a beacon of charity. Instead, it was given a house of shadows where children either never existed or disappeared into silence. The people did not forget that priests had preached from the Higgins chapel, that politicians had dined in their banquet halls, that city funds had been poured into a hollow institution. To many, the orphanage represented not just the sins of one family, but the corruption of every authority that had defended them. Charity had been twisted into exploitation, faith into deception, law into complicity. Folklore turned the story into a warning. Parents told their children that if they lied too often, they would be taken by the Higgins orphans, who had no names of their own. Lovers strolling past the ruins were cautioned not to linger, lest the pale figures in the windows envy their life and follow them home. Laborers muttered that those who grew rich on the backs of the poor would one day build houses that cried with the voices of the lost. In taverns, old men spoke of the Higginses as a curse upon Providence, a family who had fed themselves on illusions and left the city haunted by their absence. Even as the orphanage decayed, its legend grew. Ivy crept up its walls, the roof sagged, yet townsfolk refused to tear it down. Some argued it was cursed ground, best left untouched. Others said demolishing it would only release what was trapped inside. And so it stood, year after year, weathering storms and gathering moss, until it became less a building and more a monument to unanswered questions. Travelers passing through saw only a ruin. The people of Providence saw a wound. By the mid-20th century, ghost hunters and curious outsiders began visiting the site, drawn by the tales of crying children and spectral figures. They carried lanterns and cameras, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. What they found instead was silence, broken only by creaking timbers and the restless imagination of those who listened too closely. Yet even they left uneasy, convinced that the air itself inside the orphanage was heavier, colder, filled with something unseen. Thus, the Higgins orphan experiment lived on, not through official histories, but through cultural memory. The building became a story told from porch to porch, generation to generation, a cautionary tale that blurred the line between fact and folklore. It reminded the people of Providence that wealth and reputation could disguise horror, that charity could mask exploitation, and that silence from the powerful could erase the lives of the powerless. The cries in the night, the figures in the windows, the chants in the chapel, whether real or imagined, were the city's way of refusing to forget. And so, the orphanage endured, not as a sanctuary, not even as a ruin, but as a ghost in the collective memory of a community betrayed. The Higgins orphan experiment was more than a fraud. It was a scar that reshaped how Providence understood charity, power, and truth. Where the ledgers lied, the stories told the truth, carrying the voices of children who never existed into eternity. The Higgins orphan experiment ended not with revelation, but with silence. The building was abandoned, the family withdrew, and the law looked away. No graves were marked, no records restored, no children reclaimed. What remained was absence, an absence so complete that it became its own legacy. The so-called orphans of Providence left behind no trace but ink on paper, names that faded in ledgers and whispers that survived in the mouths of neighbors. Some may have lived briefly, surrendered by desperate mothers and erased upon entry. Others never lived at all, conjured only to fatten reports and swell the Higgins fortune. Yet together they formed a population of ghosts, children who never existed, and whose absence continues to haunt the city that allowed them to vanish. The image of those children lingers in collective imagination. Cribs tended by servants though empty, meals prepared but untouched, classrooms set for pupils who never arrived. Each detail, recorded in testimony decades later, painted a picture of lives fabricated and then dissolved. The Gothic weight of it is undeniable. Where other orphanages leave behind cemeteries filled with small headstones, the Higgins estate left nothing but empty earth. Where other charities inscribed names on plaques, this one buried them in false ledgers. The result was a silence deeper than death, for the Higgins children were denied even the dignity of being mourned. Walkers who pass the ruins speak of the ground itself as hollow, as if beneath its soil lies a graveyard without markers. They imagine rows of forgotten little ones, erased before their stories could be written. Whether any bones lie there or not, the impression endures. The Gothic shadow cast by absence can be as chilling as the presence of death. In Providence memory, the Higgins Orphan experiment is not just a building, but a mausoleum of unclaimed souls. The legacy is cruelest in its refusal to answer questions. Were some of the children real? Did they suffer in experiments beneath the chapel floors? Did they die and vanish into unmarked graves? Or were they inventions from the start, numbers scrawled in careful copperplate to harvest grants and charity? Each possibility carries horror. If they lived, their silence was forced upon them, their identities erased by deceit. If they never lived, then an entire community was tricked into grieving for phantoms, complicit in a lie that siphoned hope and money from those who trusted. The ledgers themselves became relics of this deception. Bound in leather, filled with immaculate handwriting, they once stood as proof of order and care. Now they read like tombstones of paper children: Anna, Samuel, Clara, names repeated year after year without aging. Their ink is fading, their pages brittle, but their false testimony still whispers of lives that might have been. In a cruel way, the Higgins family succeeded. They wrote their orphans into being more convincingly than the world ever managed to erase them. Providence, in turn, bears the shame. Churches accepted donations, politicians praised the family, doctors signed prescriptions for patients they never saw. When the truth threatened to surface, authorities declared insufficient evidence, ensuring that the experiment would never face trial. The lesson is systemic. When records lie, when institutions choose silence, memory becomes the only witness. The voices of laundresses who tended empty sheets, of midwives who surrendered infants to silence, of neighbors who heard cries at night, these became the true archive. Their accounts, fragile and fragmentary, are all that remain to honor the never-existed children. Over time, the orphanage became less a scandal than a parable. Parents told stories of phantom orphans to warn children against deceit. Writers described the Higgins estate as a symbol of the Gilded Age's corruption, where wealth and charity cloaked exploitation. Historians note it not as a triumph of philanthropy, but as a case study in complicity. The Higgins Orphan experiment became a mirror reflecting the dangers of unchecked power, the ease with which entire systems can be bent to sustain lies, and the haunting cost of silence. The Gothic imagery persists. The empty graves that were never dug, the names inscribed only in fading ledgers, the cries said to echo from bricked windows, all these linger as emblems of erasure. The orphans may not have lived, but in being denied life, they became eternal. They haunt Providence not as ghosts of flesh and bone, but as phantoms of memory, proof that sometimes absence itself can wound more deeply than presence. In the end, the Higgins Orphan experiment stands as a lesson carved not in stone, but in silence. When the powerful control the records, when signatures replace truth, whole lives can be written out of existence. And when the records are gone, when graves are empty and names fade, memory remains the only witness. It is memory, fragile yet unyielding, that keeps the children alive, not in the world they were denied, but in the story that refuses to let them vanish. The legacy of the Higgins Orphan experiment is thus not the grandeur of its halls or the wealth of its benefactors, but the haunting of children who never existed, whose silence continues to speak louder than all the ledgers ever written.